Good evening and welcome to this evening's feature presentation, Our Local History Spotlight, A Carrying Place, Oshawa's Indigenous Story. I'll begin with a land acknowledgement. The land we are standing on today is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We acknowledge that Oshawa is covered under the Williams Treaties, and as settler on these lands, we are all treaty people. May we respectfully honor the knowledge and understanding of the Indigenous stewards of these ancestral lands and ensure that the voices of the First Peoples are represented in our collections, programs, and services. So in celebration of Indigenous History Month, we are going to learn this evening about two archaeological sites, specifically in Oshawa, that were home and evidence of home to the Ancestral Wendat in the 1400s. And Melissa Cole, curator of the Oshawa Museum, is here to explore this history with us. She'll take us on a bit of a journey from a timeline of inhabitation of the area and will bring us up to more present day near the end, and there will be time for questions. If you do have questions during the presentation, please put them in the chat box as you think of them, or at the end of the presentation, we can have you go live with your microphone to ask Melissa a question if you so choose. So I will stop talking now and I will turn it over to Melissa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicole, for that lovely introduction and for the land acknowledgement as well. I'm just going to get ready to share my screen. I'm going to actually turn my camera off, but I will turn it back on again when I come back on for questions. So at the Oshawa Museum, just as Nicole has done, we start our programs and other events with the land acknowledgement just the same. Land acknowledgements are formal statements and recognize the traditional First Nation, Métis, and or Inuit territories of a place and the relationship to and the stewardship of the land. They are a starting place to change how the land is seen, talked about, as well as an important step towards truth and reconciliation. Hello, and thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Melissa Cole, and I'm the curator at the Oshawa Museum. I am a settler of British descent, and I want to thank you for joining us this evening on what is a beautiful night, and it is also summer solstice. I'm going to talk a little bit about a carrying place, which is an exhibit that we have at the Oshawa Museum, and it opened in 2017. A lot of research and consultation went into this exhibit, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the knowledge that I gained through this process. So the location of the Oshawa Museum is on land that has been shaped by human hands for thousands of years. For far too long, the history of Oshawa has typically been told with a gaping hole, leaving out the perspectives of the First Nations that called this land home for thousands of years before Europeans arrived. The story of Oshawa's settlement did not begin with Benjamin Wilson, a white American from Vermont who settled in Oshawa in 1795. There is much more to the story than that. Archaeological excavations at two sites here in Oshawa have assisted us in challenging this traditional story of settlement. We opened our exhibit in 2017, and we continue to add to it through additional displays from the community in the community space of it. So consultation and research for this exhibit started in 2014. And I wish to offer my gratitude to the following individuals, some who are with us today and unfortunately some who are not. So at the time, Dave Mowat was responsible for the land consultation and membership at the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation. Today, he is the chief of Alderville First Nation. Dan Denby, he was an ally in the Scugog community of the Mississaugas. Dr. Amy Barron, Michelle Savard, he's a curator at the Huron-Wendat Museum in Quebec, and staff and elders through various other community organizations, including Professor Shirley Williams, Nancy Hammer, who was involved with the Durham District School Board, who's now retired, Dr. Ron Williamson, the archaeologist who oversaw Grandview site, and of course, our exhibit designer, Matthew Bates. These are just a few of the individuals that have been instrumental in helping me with the knowledge that I'm sharing tonight. So archaeology is the study of human groups that lived in the past. And by looking at the complexities of their social, political, and economic and spiritual lives, archaeologists focus frequently on the patterning and nature of material culture. Archaeological sites are fragile and non-renewable. Ontario has legislation through the Planning Act and the Environmental Assessment Act that both require archaeological resource assessments as well as a built heritage and cultural landscape analysis. They must be carried out in advance of most land disturbing activities, such as infrastructure projects, housing, or industrial developments. The majority of sites found in Ontario were left by people living here before the arrival of Europeans. One must remember that these sites have cultural and spiritual significance for their descendants. The Indigenous occupants of these sites left no written record of their lives, but their legacy consists of oral histories and traditions passed on through their descendants. Archaeologists are encouraged and must engage with descendant communities in the identification, evaluation, and conservation of archaeological sites in the life of the project. This has not always been the case, but it is today. So what has archaeology assisted in telling us? It plays an important role in how we interpret the past here at the Oshawa Museum. Most First Nations living in Ontario today fall under two broad language groups, the Algonquins and the Haudenosaunee. Within these larger groups are unique nations, histories, and cultures. Archaeology has told us that Oshawa was once home to the Ancestral Wendat from around 1350 to 1450. These dates are known through research at these sites. Material culture from both of these sites has suggested that sometime before 1400, the Huron-Wendat came from the Duffins Creek area in the Rouge Valley watershed and expanded east and settled on Harmony Creek at the Grandview site. The new village was sustained by farming, fishing, and hunting until around 1450, when the village was abandoned and they settled at the McLeod site, which was only 5.5 kilometers to the west. And I'm going to show you a little map to show you how close they actually were. Harmony Creek at the time would have provided an abundance of Atlantic salmon in the fall. This harvest was important in the winter diet of the Ancestral Wendat. The McLeod archaeological site located at, which are what these images here are from, was located at the corners of Thornton and Roslyn Road in Oshawa. This particular village dated from around 1450. It was one of the first known settlements in the Oshawa area, and it was first discovered in the fall of 1967 on the property of Howard McLeod, which is where the name comes from. Several groups excavated the site. It was overseen by the University of Toronto. During the excavation, there were longhouses that were uncovered. There was a large palisade, which was a protective wall, which was quite interesting, showing that it was constructed for protection purposes, either due to warfare or other reasons. The village was located on approximately 3 to 4 acres, and there was approximately 5 longhouses. In each longhouse was home to families, all of which were related through their female members, forming a clan. The inhabitants of the McLeod site were agriculturalists and did not generally hunt large game, but smaller game, which would have been in the area, such as deer. Wild plants were also gathered, and of course, salmon was a large part of their diet. So this is images from the Grandview site. It was an archaeological site located south of Taunton Road and west of Grandview Street North. It was discovered in 1992 while the area was being prepared for the development of a new subdivision. Archaeological Services Incorporated was contacted and a salvage excavation project was begun to unearth as much as possible about the site. The remains of a village were unearthed, which consisted of 12 longhouses. It's estimated that the site was inhabited from approximately 1450 to from 1400 to 1450. Again, they were agriculturalists. However, they did not rely totally on what they grew, and also their diet was supplemented by wild roots and plants that they gathered in the area. And they relied heavily on deer and salmon. So this is a map just kind of showing you where these two sites are related in relation to each other. And this is interesting, and many archaeologists have also found it interesting, and research has been, some papers have been published about the fact that the sites are possibly connected. What was found at both of the sites were pottery that had a special glaze on it. Really, it was new technology at the time. And this special slip would have made their ceramics less porous, and the ability to hold water better. So it was a unique glazing that was being used on the pottery. So pretty incredible inventions happening at the time as well. Another interesting fact about where the Grandview site is located, I've put an image here from Google Map showing a park that's called Iroquois Shoreline Park. And many people wonder where that name came from. One interesting fact about this name is that the area now known as Oshawa lies on a glacial geological feature called the Lake Iroquois shoreline. Lake Iroquois was a lake formed at the end of the glaciation period by melting glacial ice in the Lake Ontario basin. At that time, the St. Lawrence River Valley was blocked with ice and the lake level rose above present-day Lake Ontario. And it actually would drain southeast towards Syracuse, New York. The shoreline is typified by washed sand and gravel beach bluffs. Remnants of this shoreline can still be seen in various communities today along the north shore of Lake Ontario. And if you're at Iroquois Shoreline Park, you can see that there is a bit of a ridge as well there, which would have been the original shoreline of the lake at that time. So this particular map that I'm sharing now is one of the first surveys of Whitby Township, and it was completed by Augustus Jones. And it also shows a trail known today as the Scugog Carrying Place Trail. And he indicated this directly on this survey, which was completed in 1795. This area of Oshawa was an important carrying route for First Nations. The Oshawa Creek was much larger than it is today, and groups would congregate at the mouth of the Oshawa Creek and Lake Ontario every spring and fall to fish. So from the earliest days, the First Nations would use these pathways and carrying places or portages for hunting and trading. The Scugog Carrying Place is one of several routes and carrying places that connected the interior of the land, rich with resources, to Lake Ontario. In an interview with Dave Mowat, he states, quote, "There is the old Scugog Carrying Place route that came down from the lakeshore at Oshawa, made its way up to Lake Scugog here, and eventually to Georgian Bay. If you can think of how the land was utilized before we had the 401, before we had all our highways and byways, when you think about how the land was utilized, some of our original roads are old portage trails and carrying places. Simcoe Street relatively follows the original Scugog Carrying Place. It comes across at Purple Woods, then goes towards Georgina. It does make perfect sense that that would be the trail that our people would use," unquote. The trail can be best described as an inverted Y. From Lake Ontario, one branch went northward by Harmony Creek and the other by the Oshawa Creek. Canoes would have been used as far up the creek as they could go before portaging. The two footpaths converged near the present Columbus and then united across the location of present-day Port Perry. Here's just a close-up version where you can see just a bit of that trail. So I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this is the trail here. And actually, Augustus Jones has also noted that Wilson's cabin is here too, Benjamin Wilson, which is noted right near the bottom there. Oh. So there are archaeological sites along the carrying place that confirm it actually had ancient roots. Many of the sites are actually located along the eastern branch of the Scugog Carrying Place. And two of the sites are located in Oshawa, Grandview and McLeod, the ones that I've talked about. And just over 8 miles north of the Grandview site, in the headwaters of the Oshawa Creek, is another site known as the Pasco site. These villages, McLeod and Grandview, the villages actually relocated and migrated north. Today, the Wendat are in Quebec. So the ancestral Wendat vacated the area around the Scugog Carrying Place by the end of the 16th century. It's possible that the Iroquois, Mohawk that were coming across from the north shore, or sorry, the south shore of Lake Ontario, coming in from the Six Nations, possibly might have also utilized this shore, or sorry, this pathway when they were coming through. It's possible that the trail also fell into disuse until the Mississauga came to Lake Scugog and Lake Ontario. The Mississauga used the trail at some point after 1700, and it was in use in 1795 when the first survey was being carried out by Augustus Jones. The Scugog carrying place allowed the Huron-Wendat and the Mississauga to practice their culture and economic way of life by linking them to their fishing and hunting sites. The Mississauga are a subgroup of the Great Anishinaabeg Nation, a nation made up of various subgroups such as the Nipissing, the Ottawa, the Potawatomi, and the Ottawa. The Mississauga of Scugog Island are a branch of the Ojibwe Three Fires Confederacy, one of the largest First Nations group in Canada. According to oral tradition, the Anishinaabe originally lived along the northeast coast of North America. 7 prophets came to the people and warned that they must leave the area or they would be destroyed. They made 7 prophecies about the future of the Anishinaabe. These prophecies are called the 7 fires, and the path they were to follow describes 7 places at which they would stop during the migration. Actually, this was a story that was recommended to me by a few individuals I was talking with during the consultation process. It is available at most libraries. It's the Anishinaabe migration story, and it's featured in the Mishomi's book, The Voice of the Ojibwe by Edward Benton Benai. And I highly recommend it. It's actually even good for children as well, as it includes sketches like this that are easy to look at and learn from. This migration took place over 500 years ago and began around 900 Common Era. The Mississauga of Scugog Island moved southward from their former homeland north of Lake Huron around 1695. They moved into southeastern Ontario with the fur trade and established hunting grounds as far east as Kingston and as far north as Lake Nipissing. Mississaugas settled in various community groupings at the mouth of Credit River, Rice Lake, Little Mud Lake, known as Shamong today, and on the shores of Lake Scugog. This is an ES shrapnel print, and it's showing just these are wigwams belonging to the Mississauga, this print indicates that they were establishing their homes across the Scugog area. Just that while they were here, the extensive wetlands in this area were rich with fish, and wild rice was plentiful at the time. Maple trees would have provided for sap and syrup, and birch trees would have been available for bark and wigwams and canoes. Lots of game and small animals and plants were available for food as well. So Peter Jones, son of Augustus Jones, who was the surveyor I talked about earlier with the Scugog Carrying Place Trail, he had resided with his Mississauga extended family until he was around 15. In 1823, Peter Jones became a Methodist preacher, and a year later began his missionary work, his missionary career among the Ojibwe Indians of Upper Canada. He appears along the Scugog Carrying Place Trail on January 21st, 1827, when they address at a camp in Darlington Township. According to his diary, he came up the trail to visit the Mississauga of Scugog in April 1828. In addition to his missionary work, Peter Jones acted as a spokesman for the Mississauga and was instrumental in the establishment of plots for farming and planting seeds. The Mississauga depended on seasonal vegetation, particularly wild rice. In 1830, a dam and mill were constructed along the Scugog River, causing the river to rise by 10 feet and flooding part of Scugog and swamped their rice fields. Their chief at the time was Chief Jacob Crane, and he went with the group to Mud Lake, Shamong. In 1836, Chief Jacob Crane and part of the band moved further west to Balsam Lake. They would once again move back to Lake Scugog in 1844 because the climate was better suited for agriculture. Thanks to the efforts of Chief Jacob Crane and his people, who paid with their own money for an 800-acre landlocked parcel on Scugog Island. I'm also just going to briefly talk about the Williams Treaties as well. They were signed in October and November of 1923 by the governments of Canada and Ontario, and by 7 First Nations of the Chippewa of Lake Simcoe, and the Mississauga of the North Shore of Lake Ontario. However, treaties often included poor descriptions, missing signatures, confusing boundary lines, and miscommunication due to language barriers. The Williams Treaties were no exception to these issues. Government officials were already conducting land acquisition treaties with the Mississauga and Ojibwe people, who neither really understood the language of these strangers, nor fully understood the concept of permanently selling their Mother Earth. Millions of acres of valuable land were given up through these treaties with very little received in return. Unfortunately, fair dealings were not the order of the day. In one instance, a 100-mile stretch of land about 20 kilometers wide along Lake Ontario from roughly Trenton to Toronto was ceded, but the treaty was so flawed that government officials later privately agreed that it was invalid. The Mississauga people, however, were not so informed, and that land was quickly taken up by non-native settlers. In another case, the land on the west side of Lake Scugog, all the way north to Lake Simcoe, was not negotiated or treated for with the Mississauga people at the time. They were simply ignored and swept aside, and the land was given out to non-native settlers, who chopped down forests to make their homes. Believe it or not, it wasn't until June 2018 that the Williams Treaty First Nations was ratified. The Williams Treaty Settlement Agreement with Canada and Ontario, as it relates to harvesting, the Williams Treaties Settlement Agreement recognizes that the Williams Treaties First Nations continuing pre-Confederation treaty harvesting rights, that they have the ability to harvest fish, wildlife, trapping, and gathering in the numbered treaties 5, 16, 18, 20, 27, and 27 and a quarter. Just to give you a brief rundown on the Williams Treaties, and you can actually see copies. They are digitized, and you can see copies of the treaties online through the Library and Archives Canada. Before the Williams Treaty, there was the Gunshot Treaty, and it was created. While a great deal of the area in central and southern Ontario was claimed shortly before 1923, a land mass in southern Ontario was discovered but not surrendered. The Gunshot Treaty and 3 other large land settlement treaties were revoked because they involved signing blank documents. This land is in Prince Edward and Northumberland counties and Durham region. And just a little, did you know the Gunshot Treaty was given its name because the written documents of the treaty stated that the First Nations could not come within a gunshot of York at Lake Ontario. The dish with one spoon wampum. This is another important piece as well, as this is the agreement for all First Nations, including the Haudenosaunee and the Mississaugas, of moving together and showing that relationship and moving together and sharing the land and sharing the resource. And there are various types of wampums that you'll see. They're made of beads. This is an example of the dish with one spoon wampum. You can learn a lot more about them online as well. So the First Nations in our community today, these are just a few of the resources. The City of Oshawa also has some great resources on their website. I was just on it today, and I was quite impressed with all the links. I know various other organizations have a lot of events happening. There are so many ways for you to learn more about our community. And just a little bit about the Mississaugas today. This is actually a photograph from one of their powwows, which is a very popular event that happens on Scugog Island, and I highly recommend that everyone attends that. It's usually held in July. So for over a century and a half, the Mississaugas had tried subsistence farming over the years. They've had many ups and downs, as we know, and in spite of the heavy enlistment for the Great Wars, if you're in Alderville, I do believe there's a war memorial there as well. There's a history of residential schools, the 60 scoop, the dwindling, they even went through a dwindling member population. The Mississauga people have survived and rebuilt their community. After much forward thinking and hard work, they opened their community economic development project in 1997 through the Great Blue Heron Casino. With the advent of the casino also came the Bowguading Community Association, which was run by members of Scugog Island First Nation and the charitable arm of the Great Blue Heron. I know many donations through that go out into the community. Through building community networks, the Mississauga of Scugog Island First Nation have built relationships of trust and respect with the Scugog Township, the Durham region, and the local townspeople. Local employment is now available to First Nations members, and the population has increased considerably, and efforts are being undertaken to revitalize the culture. There are language classes that you can take. There are various community events underway. I actually saw today the Township of Scugog unveiled an art piece connected back to the Moccasin Project as well. The future definitely looks bright for the Mississauga of Scugog Island First Nation. So over the years, I've been very privileged to talk with and learn from various knowledge keepers and friends and partners from various Indigenous organizations in the community. I've learned about the importance of the land and the connection to the earth and the respect for ancestors and kinship ties within communities, and the vital role of oral tradition and the keepers of those traditions, including the value of language and music. There's a lot more learning I still have to do. I've developed a tremendous respect for the strength and resiliency of Indigenous people, in spite of all attempts by government and religious organizations to eliminate their culture, traditions, spirituality, and language. Indigenous cultures continue to survive and thrive. It's our living history. National Indigenous History Month is an opportunity for us all to reflect on and expand our knowledge and understanding and history of languages and traditions and spiritualities of cultures and contributions of our First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I thank you very much for joining me this evening. And I will start my video. So there we go. So that was like a little brief snapshot of our Indigenous history. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
I don't know if there's any, I was just checking the chat to see if there's any questions coming in. I don't see any there right now.
I see a raised.
There's one raised hand. So if you'd like, you can unmute yourself and ask the question. That would be Rayanne.
Yes.
Hi, Rayanne.
Hi, Nicole. Thanks, Melissa. Could you just tell us again where those archaeological sites were located? I think
yes.
One was Roslyn and Thornton.
Yes, that's correct. Roslyn and Thornton, and the other one was Taunton and Grandview Harmony area in Oshawa.
Okay,
there's a
great.
subdivision there now, and if you Google Iroquois Shoreline Park, it'll kind of take you in the midst of where that village was on Taunton. Yeah. And if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to email me at curator@oshawamuseum.org. Yes, rice is still growing on Lake Scugog in the area. I know, especially closer to Rice Lake area, I know there are many Indigenous that are still actively harvesting rice in the area. Even when I was talking with Dave Mowat at the time, I know he also was still harvesting rice as well. So yes, rice is definitely still harvested. Not necessarily as plentiful as it used to be, but it is still harvested.
We had a question as well about the language learning classes
yes.
you mentioned, and they're looking for where would we find more information about that?
I don't want to say no like specific ones right now, but I do know that if you follow this Mississauga of Scugog Island First Nation, if you follow their social media pages, they actually have live language classes. I know they were doing that during COVID. I believe the RMG actually just held Melody Crow. It was more geared to kids, but again, it was related. I was talking about animals, and I believe that was on the weekend. So there are various language classes out there. Yeah, thank you, Nicole. She just put in the Scugog Island First Nation website. There's also local groups in the community that may have language classes as well. Caria has different programs as well.
Yeah, there's more to be, there's plenty out there if you know what you're sort of looking for. I think it's looking specifically, as you mentioned, the Mississaugas as
yes.
well as Caria, who do cover that.
And I highly, like, if you actually go on, I'm going to say the City of Oshawa's website, because I was just on it today, and they actually have a really great section on there with a lot of great links, and it's just all in one section on their website as well. And it actually links to a lot of to all the local resources as well, just in one section. We usually, I believe the Oshawa Museum probably has one on our blog as well. I'd actually be happy to, I don't know if we have like the list, Nicole, if you want me to send out a list that I can send to you, and then you can email it to participants possibly.
Yeah.
I'd be happy to do that.
Okay, I'll take care of that. You could send that to me. I've sent the link. I put the link into the City of Oshawa's National Indigenous History Month.
Yeah, it was a great
links.
Yeah, it was a great site. So that's definitely a starting point, and just a starting point. It's continuous. So I see a comment from Grace, and thank you, Grace, for your comment. I'm happy to share what I've learned. So most of what I know is specific to the area. It's what we get asked about. Remember, there were no boundaries. So it's amazing to look at maps. Actually, the Canadian Community Museum, Nicole and I were just talking about this, they have an awesome map on display that literally just shows rivers, no borders, nothing. And it's envision our North America like that. When you see the map, it's not quite the same.
That was at the
Canadian Community Museum. They're actually going through, they're going through a reopening. So I'm hoping that map makes it over to the new space. I believe it's a township of Scugog had an unveiling project today. I saw somebody was asking about that. I noticed they had unveiling today. Chief Kelly LaRocca was up there. I know they were doing something with the Moccasin project as well. They had students involved doing some stenciling on the ground. And I believe there was a small plaque unveiled as well, I believe.
Great.
Someone asked a question about Thornton Road North and Rossland, and if I know if they found anything and what they were doing. I'm not really sure. That's from Ava. I don't know off the top of my head, unfortunately, so I apologize. But that is the area close by where, so maybe they are doing some more work, because I know some of the collection for that. So who knows, they might have found, I'm not sure. I will look into that though.
Because as you mentioned there, Melissa, as well, all archaeology disturbs sites. So they're not going to dig up an entire area to see what all is there. So it's possible over time, more things are discovered with development. As we know, the northern part of the city is just exploded. So
yeah. And there are sites that we don't have collections for. Like I know the 407, there was quite a few. I think there are other sites that were discovered as well. I'm just not as familiar with all of the collections, but in terms of Wendat, these are the only two I'm most familiar with. And then Pickering and other communities, there's a whole, they're in this area for quite some time. And there's a question about Dr. Allen. I've heard the name, but I'm not as familiar. So I am going to familiarize myself.
Sir, the question was, are you familiar with Dr. Alan Corbier's work regarding the wampum? So
yeah.
Corbier.
Yep. Yep. I appreciate that recommendation. This is what I like when people give back to my knowledge as well. So I appreciate that. Thank you. If
there's any other questions coming in, I think I had a couple of questions, although Melissa and I have been chatting quite a bit about in the last few months on Indigenous history and the displays they have at the Oshawa Museum. If you haven't had a time to check it out, you should check out the Oshawa Museum's it's called Carrying Place, Oshawa's Indigenous Story. So Melissa showed a couple pictures of it from the beginning of her presentation. They have we call a recreation or of the longhouse, like sort of the inside of a longhouse, as well as a small model of a longhouse and what it would have looked like, and lots of artifacts on display, and lots of information panels, and it tells in more detail with more visuals of the story that Melissa is talking about. And so we're always looking for more information on that, and I've been partnering with Melissa to create some kind of a display as well at the Oshawa libraries. So when you come into the history room, you also know the history of the the ongoing history of this area, which has been from a colonial settler perspective for so many generations that we're changing that narrative. We're shifting to showing more of the earlier history of this area.
And it's really great to work together on that as well, because this exhibit happened a while ago and it needs nothing's permanent, but this is an ongoing story that we're going to continue to tell. So I see the space evolving over time. We definitely need to have other languages incorporated into the space. There's still work to be done. There always is. And we do have the community space where we can share that, allow others to come in and share their story as well. And I think there's a hand raised.
Melissa,
Yes. Hello, Susan. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. What happened between the 1450 when the cloud group moved on? And
Yeah. Why did they move on?
well, I imagine they moved on because they needed new land or new animals to
Yes.
harvest. But what happened to the area from then until Wilson came?
Well, the Mississauga were here in the area from 1700. And we know that the Haudenosaunee coming over the Iroquois from the Six Nations, like Mohawk over on the North Shore, I keep saying North, South Shore, possibly would have been moving into the area as well. Out in Prince Edward, we have Tyendinaga Mohawk territory. So there's possibility that they were moving into the area and possibly pushing out the Wendat as well. And the Wendat meant they just moved more north, and they're still around today. They're in Quebec. So these were their ancestors that were here. And like I said, when I talked about the Mississauga migration story, they started more coming into the area like 1695. So I do believe there could have been others in the area, but there's just no actual settlement occurring that we know of.
So it's more of a traveling.
Yeah, and with the Wendat, once they used up like the land, like once the resources were no longer available, they would move on. And sometimes they would possibly move on for other reasons as well. It could have been warfare, but usually it was the land was, they needed new land. They didn't have like farming like we do today. So they didn't have which stuff that we fertilizer. Like it's what we do to the land to make it useful for farming is very different than what was available at the time. Yes, I see the Friends of the Second Marsh. Yes, the Moccasin Project. So thank you, Helen Bright, for bringing that up. Actually, the Moccasin Project is actually a Durham-wide project that's happening. Purple Woods is sort of taking the lead on this and brought us all together. Museums, galleries, libraries, and the city, the municipalities are coming together and bringing this Moccasin project to the area. And Friends of Second Marsh and us are looking to partner with us both being along the lakefront. And Second Marsh is really the southern terminus of the Scugog Carrying Place Trail. So, and yes, Grace, that's another. There are some very good online courses regarding Indigenous history in Canada presented on Coursera. So I actually took that one as well. It's actually very good, and I do believe I believe it's free.
It is, yes.
Yeah,
I think it's free.
Yep. Yes, it would be nice to see signs along Simcoe that name the carrying place. There is a sign right at the entrance of Second Marsh off of Colonel Sam Drive. I actually should have included that in my presentation today. I apologize. I have a lovely image of it. It's right, I'm not going to say it's a lovely spot, but it is right in front of the water treatment plant, but it's also very visible. So when you first come to the opening of the Second Marsh path there off of Colonel Sam, the sign, there is a plaque right there for the carrying place. I agree though, Simcoe Street would be nice too. Thanks everyone for the great discussion and comments. I appreciate that.
I think there was another, looks like Doe had included links to Dr. Corbier's work. There's a link there if anyone else is interested in that information on his history.
Oh yes.
and histories of the treaties and between different peoples and the wampum specifically. For those that aren't aware as well, could you explain a little bit about what wampum is?
The wampum, I'm not an expert on the wampum as much. I know it was usually I know it's beads. And I do know that it was about building relationships and moving together and working together and amongst different groups.
So I think it was seen as an agreement.
It
like
was.
A wampum belt was sort of an agreement document, if you will.
It'd be like the treaty. It's like it's like a paper, what we consider a contract. That is kind of what it was. I hate to use the word contract with wampum, but
an agreement. Yeah, it was sort of like,
okay. Doe said, may I share more about what little I know? Yes, I don't see why not, for sure.
Sure, please do.
Definitely. I appreciate that.
Sorry.
Give it more justice than I can, because it's not just, I can't describe the beating.
Yeah, so the wampum was actually, there were many uses to it. First of all, it was a form of currency, right? So people along the eastern eastern seaboard, I guess you call it, made the wampum, right? The wampanoag, and all along the shore. So they made that out of quahog shells and what's the white one called? Oh, there's another white one. So the white one, I can't remember the name of it, but the quahog made the purple part of it.
Yep.
And so that was a form of economy so that you could trade items to get the wampum, but the wampum was really important because of these treaties. And I learned a lot of this because I used to work at the Royal Ontario Museum as an Indigenous knowledge resource teacher for a while, for 4 years. But I also listened to Dr. Corbière doing some presentations on these. And so within his research, the dish with one spoon treaty, which is that wampum that you had shown, is actually one of the oldest treaties known. And it was between the Anishinaabe people and the Haudenosaunee peoples who were south of Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence, because they were fighting all the time. And then so his oral history research date that to about 1100 AD, the first initiation of that treaty of, okay, we're going to make peace, we're going to share the land. And treaties in that time period were more about, okay, this is the boundary, there's a space in between, and we'll hunt here, you'll hunt there, and we'll get along if we keep to that.
Yes.
In 1701, because of the fur trade, there was a lot of fighting that moved north, because in New York State, the Haudenosaunee peoples down there pretty much decimated the beaver population. And so they had to move where there were more furs. And so they ended up moving more farther north than they were before. And so it's called the Beaver Wars. And the Anishinaabe peoples north of Lake Ontario and that Lake Huron and stuff, they're fierce. And so they were decimating the Haudenosaunee. And so then there was this great peace that happened in Montreal at a big meeting in 1701, which is when the dish with one spoon was again reinitiated. Now, some people have modernized it and said that the dish with one spoon is also inclusive now of people who are living here, right? But originally it was between the Anishinaabe peoples and the Haudenosaunee saying, okay, let's live peaceably because we can't sustain this kind of war and loss among our peoples and our warriors and all that kind of stuff. So that's the last time that they actually had to initiate it, was in 1701, and it was maintained and it continues to be maintained. So the people that were originally in there were the two groups, which included the Mississaugas, of course. But now people talk about the dish with one spoon, and it's about, all the nations that live here now, we're living peaceably, we need to share the land and all that. But originally it was between those two groups. So, and I get this all from Dr. Corbière's work. I mean, that's his dissertation, right? And now he's working at York. And if you ever get a chance, like any of you, to hear him speak, he's very, much more entertaining than I am, but it's so informative, right? Because it draws on oral histories and modern understandings of those histories, and then also artifacts and material cultures. So it's very interesting.
Yeah,
Anyway,
I really
thanks.
appreciate it. Thank you so much. And for providing, that was excellent. And I'm actually going to check out his material tonight. So there's a lot of different wampums, and I love the stories connected to them. And I really appreciate you sharing that tonight.
Thank you so much. That was so informative. I know
It
there's
really was.
there's such a wealth of knowledge out in the community, and it takes, I think, us asking the questions as well, for those of us that don't know, to ask the questions of we need to know. And this is just one part of, you know, what we're trying to offer from our perspective, to use a little bit of our platform to amplify those voices. So thank you so much, Joe.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll be reaching out to you to maybe speak on another topic later
Yeah,
on.
I'm thinking, guest speaker.
So I think we might, the questions have kind of stopped there. I don't see anything else coming in. We're reaching around to just about 10 to the hour. So what we'll do is we'll wrap it up for this evening. I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening to learn about Oshawa's Indigenous story, the parts of it that we currently know based on the archaeological and historical and oral tradition of the history of the area. And I hope to see you all next time when we're speaking in September 30th. We're having Brian Beaver from Alderville First Nation speaking to us about the history of Alderville First Nation. He's written a book which has recently just come out. We have here in the Oshawa Library, and he'll also be speaking about the history of residential schools for National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, which is September 30th. So you won't be able to register for that quite yet. Our newsletter is not out yet for September, but I booked him. He's come in and he's helping me with a number of things in our history room as well. So thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.